Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for December 23rd, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this conversation, everybody. If you listened to our last review on the Zone of Interest, I am happy to report we're going to be talking about something that is also bleak, but not quite as horrifying as the Zone of Interest.
Although, I did mention this during our conversation of the Zone of Interest, that movie and Ferrari, maybe not necessarily companion pieces, but we can mine similar conversations from them in what they choose to depict violently, I'll simply say.
I will say, though, my point and all of that is to say the tone isn't quite as drastic. In fact, Ferrari, for all of its tragedy, is quite funny, or at least there's several beats of levity here.
Oh, we'll talk about it.
That is absolutely absent in the Zone of Interest.
Those Italians. They know how to crack a joke sometimes.
Yeah. And look, say what you will about Ferrari. Say what you will about it. We'll talk about its humor, its drama, its heartache. The one thing that is objective about it is that Shailene Woodley's accent is hysterical.
Well,
it is.
Okay, we're gonna go there.
Bad.
We're
so funny.
We are gonna go there because it is so jarring. It had me question whether Lena Lardy, who she's playing, was actually like half American or something. And honestly, like I don't know.
I don't know either.
It seriously made me think that I'm trying to find more information on Lena Lardy as a person and where she came from, because it honestly sounds like Shailene Woodley is only committing to like 15% of the Italian accent.
Oh my gosh. If that at all, it's so hysterical. It is, again, objectively very funny. I laughed quite a bit.
And I love her as an actress. And again, I don't think she's necessarily bad in the movie. It's just her accent. It's just the accent.
The accent is really bad. It does feel as if, and I'm assuming they didn't shoot this in order, so maybe this was more accidental than anything, because I feel like in those first couple of scenes, and we see her pretty early on in the film, you do hear it a little bit. It's slightly there, and then she just utterly gives up. And then there's no accent through half of this movie. It's just Shailene Woodley.
Yeah, and if it does come, it only ever comes on closing sentences, right? The closing moments of a sentence or a word.
I think at a certain point she just gave up. I can't do this. I was miscast, at least in terms of trying to provide an accent. I think dramatically she's fine.
Yeah,
but
she's fine.
Can't really do the accent, and so it's hilarious. It is absolutely one of the best qualities of the film, for sure.
I had a mental note that I wanted to talk about her performance and her accent. I didn't know we were going to get right to it before we even introduced the movie. So, okay, I guess I can cross that off my list. We've already talked about it.
We've already look, I wasn't going to get into Lena much in the conversation. I don't have many thoughts on the character, but I did have thoughts on Woodley, so I thought I'd get it out of the way. Because it's something we should all agree on. That brings everyone together on Michael Mann and Ferrari.
Yeah. Whether you like this movie or not, I mean, it's a Michael Mann film. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Okay, let's get into it. Maybe I should also note we talked about Michael Mann a few years ago here on the show.
We opened the manhole.
Did a fun little series on him.
Yeah.
You want to go and check that out at InSessionFilm.com. And of course, we landed last on Black Hat, which in real time, when we reviewed it here on the show back in, I don't know, what was that, 2013, 14? I can't remember when that came out.
When it first came out, I think that was 2015 when it came out.
15? So 2015. Was not a fan. However, I have, and maybe it was a byproduct of going down the manhole, I've come around on Black Hat. I am now a big fan of that movie.
I mean, yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I am as well, and that honestly will funnel into my thoughts on Ferrari, just regarding Michael Mann in general.
All right. So yes, he is back. It is Ferrari, written by the late, great Troy Kennedy Martin, who actually passed away in 2009, but is credited with writing this screenplay.
Yeah, this screenplay apparently has been sitting for a while, and apparently it has been a passion project of Michael Mann's for a long time. I think all the way back in like 1993 or something is when he first wanted to try making this, and many actors were at one point tied to it. I think Robert De Niro was somehow tied to it at one point. I don't know all of the histories, but I do know it's something Michael Mann has wanted to make for a long time.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but in his director with Ava DuVernay, because she asked him from beginning to end, how long have you been working on this? And I'm pretty sure he said 30 years, at least 30 years, if not 40.
Yeah.
So
does not surprise me.
This has been in the works for quite some time.
Yeah.
And it's finally here. It stars Adam Driver, Penelope Cruz, the aforementioned Shailene Woodley, as well as Patrick Dempsey.
I had no idea he was in this movie.
I had no idea either. What a fun little surprise that was.
Yeah.
Gabriel Leone, we should mention here as well.
Yeah.
Among a few others that come and go throughout. If you're not familiar with Ferrari, it is set in the summer of 1957 with Enzo Ferrari's auto empire in crisis. The ex-racer turned entrepreneur, he pushes himself and his drivers to the edge as they launch into the Miglia, a treacherous 1,000-mile race across Italy.
And can we just also acknowledge Adam Driver, Penelope Cruz, Driver, Cruz, Cars. I get it.
That great casting. If there was an Oscar for casting, clear winner right there. No doubt about it. All right, Brendan, what did you think about Ferrari?
I mean, it's a true Michael Mann film, right? And in true Michael Mann fashion, I need to see this one a second time.
Incomplete is where Brendan stands at the moment.
Well, okay, I don't want to say incomplete because I will say this. I do really like this movie. But the reason why I say I need to see it a second time is because every Michael Mann film since Miami Vice, they've revealed themselves to me many years later. And I feel like many people can share that same sentiment, especially a movie like Black Hat. We were just talking about that, right, JD?
Yeah.
That we were kind of mixed to lukewarm on that movie when it first came out. But we've come to realize that Michael Mann was doing some things that we were only able to decipher years later. That movie was kind of ahead of its time. And some of the things he was doing formally with even a movie like Public Enemies is worthy of conversation. So like ever since Miami Vice, he's been tapping into something that takes time to uncover, right? Yeah. And I do think Ferrari is yet another one of those films because it's carrying a lot of those same hidden traits. It's a somber, methodical, and calculated exploration of a legendary man's dark side using action and thrill as a conduit for something deeper. Like this is not a racing movie. It's about other things. It's talking about grief, workplace obsession, hidden guilt for failing your family. And that's all what makes Enzo himself a secretly broken man. And I think what's interesting about this movie, and perhaps why some people are not going to respond too well to this. The reviews have been mostly positive, but they haven't been ecstatic. Like people aren't embracing this movie 100% as I would have liked.
Michael Mann's not fully embraced.
Yeah, but you think of it like this takes place in 1957. This is 10 years after Ferrari was first founded, if I'm not mistaken. But it's taking place at a time that many would probably argue is not the most interesting time in Enzo's life. And it's an interesting choice to set the movie at this particular moment. But it's using that as a way for Michael Mann to explore the man and not let the facts and the history surround the man, right? So this way he's kind of free of that. And while the film does depict, the Miglia, as you were talking about there, so there is an element of history here. It's less about that and more about really the moments between Adam Driver and Penelope Cruz, who plays his wife. Yeah. And those scenes are electric. You talk about humor. Those scenes are surprisingly really funny. Yes. And we'll especially talk about Penelope Cruz, who is electrifying in this movie. Really steals every scene that she's in. So I do really like this movie. There are a few choices it makes that I do want to talk about and how they kind of compare to the Zone of Interest, which we were just talking about also not too long ago. Michael Mann makes some formal choices in how we choose to showcase violence and horror on screen.
Mhm.
And I think it raises a pretty interesting conversation, I'll simply say. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's a very good movie. I think it's one I'm going to like more as time goes on because Michael Mann films tend to reveal themselves much later. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case here as well.
This film rules. Absolutely rules.
Okay.
Ferrari slaps. Michael Mann at this stage of his career continues to fascinate me. And this only adds to that reverence. Part of it is how he subverts the racing movie. To your point, this isn't really about cars and racing, although there's no denying that Enzo is very much driven by that. He's Adam Drivered by that.
I'm laughing out of sheer pity for you right now.
Okay, that was bad. But my point still stands. There's a scene in this film where he talks about how he sells cars to race, whereas his competitors, such as Jaguar, I believe is the name he invokes, they race to sell cars.
Right.
Enzo is clearly motivated by racing, and he's at the heart of F1 in the 1950s, but that's not what revs Michael Mann's gears. The racing drama here mostly serves as a parallel to his home life, which is equally in flux because of his failing marriage to Laura, the Cruz character, and his thriving affair with Lena, the aforementioned Shailene Woodley playing Lena here. Part of which his son Piero is about to be confirmed, which would mean he would take up the Ferrari name, and that would then expose the secret of his affair to Laura. And to make it all the more poignant, all of this comes off the heels of his oldest son, Dino, recently passing away.
Right.
And as we see in this film, Enzo and Laura are both still very much in the grieving process. That opening scene at the grave is a heartbreaker. Absolutely
very
devastating.
quiet. Yeah, it doesn't rely on a musical score to tell us how we're supposed to feel. It lingers on Adam Driver. A close-up on his face
performances,
doesn't
oh my
cut. It's
gosh.
really good. Yeah.
Absolutely. We talked about how dispassionate the filmmaking is in The Zone of Interest. This is the opposite. There are a ton of close-ups, and Mann establishes that impeccably in that grave sequence early on. The close-ups on Driver and Cruz, respectively, is just devastating. It's almost poetic for Enzo.
Yeah.
He recently loses a son, but he's about to gain another, at least by name, in Piero. Whereas Laura is left with nothing. She's left with absolutely nothing. She does have a trump card because she's a business partner with Enzo and owns 50% of the company.
Right.
So in order for Enzo to make this big deal that he wants to make, she has to sign over her shares, giving her some power. So for as much effort as Enzo puts in to create these separate lives, his control over it is evasive. Something Mann also exhibits on the racing side as well. And that's what this film is really about. It's not about racing in F1. That might throw some people off. This is about the duality of control and Enzo trying to navigate its volatility. And I loved it. I was surprised. The marketing does not suggest that at all. It very much taps into the Ford v Ferrari or the Russia of it all in terms of the racing. But that's not what this movie is. It is about a man struggling with his obsessions, his failures, and his secrets. And you couple that with these incredible performances, and this is quintessential Michael Mann. And
it is.
I'm in love with it.
It is. Yeah. It basically the whole racing angle, the Ferrari angle of it, not Ferrari the man, Ferrari the automobile. That aspect of it is merely a vice for Enzo to deal with his pain. That's basically what it is. It's to fill that void that he feels like he's missing, and that's where his workplace obsession comes into play. That's where his failing marriage comes into play. And I can't even imagine what someone like Laura would have to go through in a situation like this. How she felt to realize that yes, I know that my marriage is failing. I know that my husband is having affairs, but I had no idea that another kid was already involved
Yep.
for all this time. And in many ways, her journey could make an interesting movie in and of itself. Having to discover that secret. There's a great movie to be mined from that as well. And Penelope Cruz, this is why her performance is so good, because if a performance wasn't good enough to tap into that with as little screen time as she has, that side might not work. But she's able to mine everything from that. And she's not even the main character. But whenever she's on screen, she almost feels like the main character.
But
so
I do love that it's emphasized here. There's more Laura to this film than there is racing.
There is, absolutely. But yeah, like she doesn't have limited screen time. But what I mean is that even though she's not the main character and it's not her conflict that is front and center, she's able to mine everything out of that when she needs to. A less capable actor would need an entire movie to evoke what needs to be evoked. And she's able to take advantage of it beautifully.
Oh my gosh. I utterly agree. And this is where I have to push back. I almost want to fight those that are calling this film stale or slow or plotting, or I've seen so many headlines that point to something along the lines of how this film is an idol or it's on cruise control until you get to the race at the end.
People like their puns. Their puns, don't they?
Like, I vehemently have to disagree with that idea, with that notion. This film is on full throttle the entire time. Just because it's not on the racetrack, someone behind the wheel shifting and pushing the pedals, that does not mean that this film is banal or dull.
No, it has an emotional thrill to it. That's the different kind of thrill.
Exactly. The family dynamic here, the conflict within Enzo, I think is ravishing, especially because of these performances. I do want to talk about Adam Driver as we go here as well. But I don't know how anyone can watch this, especially the relationship that we see between Enzo and Laura, and how they don't find that enthralling, how they don't find that as riveting as the car chase. I think that is more so than what we get at the end with the racing sequence.
I think the scenes between Cruz and Driver are the best scenes in the movie.
I think it is incredible what we see here with Laura. I love the introduction where we meet her. She pulls a gun from her closet and walks up to Enzo and points it at him and literally pulls the trigger. Obviously doesn't kill him, but she pulls the trigger, which is an incredible tone setter. Like, I love that, not just as an action that the character would do that, but to your point, Cruz and how she's able to mine every little ounce of emotion and thrill out of this character. It's incredible. Or you think about the bank scene and the reveal there and her subtle reaction, this epiphany that she has, and her actions that follow, where I'll say she takes steps to find out what the secret might be that Enzo has. Yeah. There's an object that she is able to obtain. I love what that symbolizes here. There's a couple of moments where her and Enzo are having conversations, and that object that she had obtained that is representative of a larger dynamic between them, it's just lingering there in the background. Just always kind of, adding a sizzle to the conflict between them. It's incredible. And then there's, of course, the fact that she's still grieving. There's a couple of times where that really comes through heavily, poignantly, enthralling in this film. There's
without speaking too. That's
speaking, the thing. I mean, there's a huge fight between them at one point. If she was to get nominated for an Oscar, I don't think that's the case. But if she was,
that's probably
would be her Oscar clip. I believe the social media team has already put this out there, so you can go and watch it even if you haven't seen this film.
Sure.
Where she's talking about the death of her son, and she's blaming Enzo for not doing enough, even though he did all of these things to try to save him. She still puts a lot of blame on Enzo. And then, so when you compound that with this affair that he's having and this other son of Enzo's that we as the audience know, Laura doesn't know, but we as the audience do. You compound all of that, and it just adds to the gravitas of the emotional turmoil that she's feeling. And Cruz, how she's able to tap into that, sometimes very subtly. It is overt often, but not always.
It is. Yeah.
And it's captivating. It is capital C captivating.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, but it's more
It's thrilling. It's thrilling.
hypnotizing than any of the car chase scenes in this film. It is.
The moment that really got me regarding Penelope Cruz's performance, and I watched this movie with my wife, and she said the same thing. We barely even got to know Laura at this point. But the scene where she goes to the cemetery to grieve for her son, she deliberately shows up after Enzo so she doesn't spend time with him.
Yeah.
And she doesn't say a word. But the camera lingers on her face, how she doesn't even choose to acknowledge Enzo. She ignores him very angrily and just walks in, doesn't say a word. My wife even next to me said, "Is Penelope Cruz going to be nominated for an Oscar for this movie?" I was like, I mean, we're like 5 minutes into the movie, babe. I mean, there's so much more performance. She goes, she's done barely nothing, and I want her to win already. That's how powerful she is in this movie.
She is. No, it's extremely powerful. I mean, that opening scene there at the grave is a stunner. I mean, for both Driver and Cruz, but it immediately sets the tone. And I love how that lingers, even when it's not overtly about her grief. Sometimes it's about the business. Sometimes it's about him finding out, or her finding out about this other affair. She's already She is already aware, as we see at the beginning of this film, of his affairs.
Yeah.
However, this one's different because it involves a child now. That is a new development.
Yeah.
And to see how she reacts there, it's not just that he has a son with someone else. Sure, that's going
It's
to
that
be
she no
irritating.
longer has any son, but you do. She feels
that's what it
betrayed
comes
in that
back to.
regard.
It always comes back to hers was taken from her.
Yeah.
And she's putting a lot of that blame on Enzo, and he just remedies that on his own with someone else.
Yeah.
Not that he's not grieving. He is. I believe Adam Driver and his own emotional conflict as it relates to his son.
Absolutely.
The way he
that's
talks
genuine.
about Dino,
That's genuine.
It's so genuine. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not out of selfishness. And what's so great about Driver's performance is that without directly saying it, you could tell he's starting to kind of reckon with his selfishness a little bit. Like he's becoming more aware of it, as if he knows he was complicit in something pretty bad here. And there is that recognition that perhaps he's now starting to use his work as that vice, as that distraction to fill this void.
Yeah.
And given the way that this film ends, which, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about that scene, that crash scene specifically, is very emblematic of how much control he does not have over his life right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's very purposeful. Like, I've seen some people say that they wish the movie began with that, and then we saw the rest of his life afterwards, which I think would have been a very interesting movie, but a very different movie. But I like how the crash here is meant to symbolize his lack of understanding, his lack of control over his own life, really.
I actually think that would be a disservice to the film if it opened with the crash. I don't think it would have been
it would have been a very different film. I think just historically speaking, I think it would have been a very different Ferrari movie.
It would have, but even it would be different. I also don't think it would be nearly as good, and here's why.
I'm kind of with you though.
We talked about this, or I mentioned this in my opening thoughts, and you were certainly reiterating it there as well. And that this film is about the duality of control, and Enzo having to grapple with its volatility. He has very little control, and not just in business or with relationships, but especially with death.
Yeah.
That's something that follows him at work and at home, with Dino and with his racers. The kill rate in 1957 was 50%.
Yeah.
Not to mention crowds and bystanders as well. So how do you cope? What drives your decisions when death is right behind you? I think that is very much on the top of mind with this film in every scene. And that really comes through palpably in Adam Driver's performance. And it's something that comes full circle by the end of the film. This movie already begins and ends with death. It
Yeah.
already does. So
You,
including a car crash would be redundant.
you can almost say because of that, does Enzo himself even have much of an arc here?
No, I think if anything, this is more of a circular experience
Yeah,
with
yeah,
Enzo.
yeah. And,
You know,
I was kind of thinking that.
I like the polarity that the death that it begins and ends with also tethers to what this film is at its core in terms of Enzo having to grapple with the volatility that he doesn't have control at work and at home.
Yeah, if anything,
so the fact that it begins with Dino and ends with the racing crash, I think is impeccably symbolic of that. To me,
I agree.
That's why Michael Mann here, I think, is at the top of his game.
I'm with you, and I think if anything, while Enzo may not have much of an arc here, there's at least a recognition in that lack of control, especially with that final scene he has with Piero, right?
Yeah.
So which like, if you want to talk about this movie having anything resembling like First Man vibes, it gets pretty close to some of those moments.
Well, and that's what makes Adam Driver so incredible here. I know he's not being talked about with the awards and the Oscars as well.
I know the accent is also still part of the conversation too.
I think he gives a better performance than some of those that are being talked about. This is a performance that technically might not be perfect. Say what you will about the accent. I'm not necessarily an expert when it comes to Italian accents, but
unlike Shailene Woodley, his performance is able to, I guess, mask the accent, right? Like that's
Look,
it's more about what he's conveying.
He's at least committed to it. But I think of the performance in this perspective, because there are performances that try to be immersive like this. You think of Christian Bale in something like Vice, for example, that is uncanny in terms of the resemblance of Dick Cheney, but that's a performance that is devoid of life.
Yeah.
This is a performance. Adam Driver might not be perfect technically, but he brings a humanism and a life and a genuine, sincere emotion to the character. And that's what makes his confidence here so mesmerizing to me, and why, even though he doesn't have an arc per se, it is circular as we've been talking about, but in every single scene, this is a character that is thriving and grappling with that duality, that lack of control, whether it be with his business or at home, and how these separate lives are now merging into one, thus thrusting him into, some sort of marital relational mess that he did not want himself in, but it was inevitable because his son is on the verge of being confirmed. And
so it must be reckoned with.
Wants to know, is he going to take the Ferrari name? That's significant to her, despite how Enzo might feel about Piero. And I do think that the film vividly shows that he loves his son, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But he's not with them all the time like Lena is. And so this is something that she is very adamant about. We have to get him confirmed. And by doing that, it's going to take things much more public. So regardless of whatever he's dealing with, the performance, Adam Driver's performance, gives something that, again, say what you will technically, but there's some sort of emotional vigor going on in his performance in every single moment.
Well, that's
the difference between that and others that are, again, the mimicry might be there, but maybe they lack something.
That's the thing. What do you want in biopics these days? Not you, the royal you. What do people want in biopics these days? And the problem I feel like some biopics have is that they're more about the mirror imaging of the real life figures, right? Trying to capture everything physically about the person. Where it sounds like you and I would be in the same boat. I'd rather see an expressive performance, and those attributes of mirror imaging come second, which is more or less what happens here. Clearly, Adam Driver is trying to channel Enzo Ferrari, the person, but he's also channeling the man, and that's the more important aspect because it is a
That's
very expressive performance.
yeah,
I,
exactly.
I hate making this comparison because I do genuinely like Bradley Cooper and Maestro overall as an actor, but
Yeah,
I
that
do
was
think this is
the
the
other,
better
yeah.
performance. I
But
do.
yeah, and that's the other one because and we recently talked about Maestro, so I guess I
Yeah.
can be a little bit more open with it. I
Mhm.
try not to, especially since we're in the same year. I'm always reserved when it comes to comparison because I don't think it's always appropriate.
Sure.
And I do want to reiterate in case you missed that conversation. I like Bradley Cooper overall. I especially like him more than something like a Christian Bale in Vice, for example, or other examples that you can bring up. I do
Mhm.
think he's good, but I think there is something to this where in that film, primarily because of the writing, in my opinion, I think the writing limits how deep his performance can go.
Mhm.
So Maestro is a flashy, garish vehicle for Cooper as a director, and I think it's
Yeah.
great in that regard. That's what I appreciate about Maestro anyway. But I do think it lacks the nuances performatively comparatively to something like Driver in this film. I would
For sure. Yeah.
absolutely put Driver in a 5 over Bradley Cooper, the actor.
Yeah.
Now,
Same.
Bradley Cooper, the director, we can have a
Does good
conversation
work.
about
Does
that
great work. Yeah.
in terms
Yeah.
of a 5.
But
But
clearly, he was more interested in directing Maestro than he was acting in it. But I mean,
yeah.
he had an interest in both, obviously, but definitely one commitment overshadows the other.
I agree. And that's the funny thing about Driver and his performance here, because you're talking about how there are these technical proficiencies and some actors really want to maintain the authenticity in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Adam Driver is 20 years younger than Enzo was in 1957.
Exactly.
So like
Yeah.
this film isn't aiming for some sort of grounded authenticity in terms of mimicking him. And by all accounts, I haven't really done this exercise, but I've read enough that Adam Driver doesn't even really look like Enzo Ferrari.
No, I've seen
Even
photos.
with
He
the
doesn't.
prosthetics. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting, but yeah, it's really more of a conduit to be and to be very expressive and to show. Clearly, Michael Mann just wanted an actor that was talented enough to showcase what he wanted, what he was going for. Michael Mann clearly doesn't care if Adam Driver looks the part or if he
No.
can, you know,
Or
visualize the part.
speaks the part even.
Yeah, exactly. Now, granted, I wouldn't say Adam Driver is going full House of Gucci here.
No, I agree.
But
I agree.
yeah,
It's better than
yeah,
that. Yeah.
it is definitely a much more sophisticated performance. But yeah, I honestly, I don't care if the technical side of it is accurate or not. I just care if I genuinely believe what's happening with the man.
Yeah.
What's deep down happening with him, and that
Yeah.
is conveyed. That's accurately portrayed here.
Yeah. Now, at the risk of sounding a little myopic, because Brendan and I are not Italian,
Mhm.
and that might throw you off or take you out of the movie a little bit. And I can understand if that's the
Yeah.
case. I am not Italian, so it did not take me out of the movie. I think Adam Driver does enough performatively from a technical perspective that at least you're not distracted. Even if
Yeah,
it's imperfect,
you're convinced enough.
you're convinced enough for those emotional truths to become what's most vital here.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
he conveys that impeccably for all the reasons we're talking about. And I love that. And again, I just love the duality of we get him grappling with his obsessions, with his failures, the fact that his business has all of these debts because he
Yeah.
is so invigorated by racing that the selling of cars is perhaps lacking and he needs to, pay more attention to that or do more
Yeah.
in that regard.
Yeah.
There's his failures with Laura, the conflict with, with Lena and with his son Piero and everything. Like this is
Yeah.
a man that is grappling with all these things. And at times he does come off a little obtrusive and presumptuous. And then there are times where he's affable, hilarious.
Yeah.
I think of that moment where he comes home and him and Laura have this moment of connection and they have sex on the table and he's like throwing dishes everywhere and stuff like that.
Mhm,
It's like this funny, engaging moment or some of the reactions he has at the shop when he's talking to some of the drivers. I wish I'd written down some of the dialogue, but he has some one-liners toward his drivers that are just blisteringly funny.
They're very jabby. I love it.
Very
I love it.
jabby.
Yeah.
It's great. Like, and so like you get the full experience of Enzo emotionally, like as a person. And of course you mentioned earlier, those moments he has with Piero here are so endearing. Like, he genuinely loves his son. He really does.
Yeah.
And that comes through incredibly well.
I've seen some people make the comparison to The Godfather.
Makes sense.
Yeah, at least in the way that fatherhood is depicted, and the fact that The Godfather is a movie that really uses its gangster film backdrop to tell a familial story. It's not really a gangster movie, just like this isn't really a Ferrari movie or a Ferrari automobile movie or a racing movie, right? That's just there as a conduit for more introspective things, and even going further, like The Godfather, and then this film, like that opera scene here, I think definitely carries some similar traits with The Godfather. There's also a scene in the church that actually has some really interesting editing.
Oh my gosh, that's a really great moment too.
Yeah, but it's like that moment. It's like it almost mirrors a crime film for a moment. Like these individuals who all work for Ferrari, they're listening to the gunshots in the background to see if Maserati is about to beat their record. And they all have their stopwatches out, as opposed to praying in church. They're keeping time. And the way Michael Mann depicts it, they look like gangsters, right? Like they look like criminals. But I do think that's deliberate. Clearly, it seems as though a movie like The Godfather, movies like it, are influences on Michael Mann here and trying to channel something introspective, despite the genre that it's playing in.
I agree. I love all of those moments as well. And I love the irony. I mentioned earlier that Enzo has put himself in some hot water. He's losing money on his racing adventures. And as a result, he's not being forced, but his bankers are telling him, hey, you need to start selling cars. That needs to be a priority in terms of commercially doing that. So as much as he wants to be a racer, because of his choices in this film, much of what we see with Enzo on the business side is a marketer. He becomes a marketing man. One of my favorite moments of this film is when Enzo grabs the Linda Christian character, and at first it looks a little presumptuous physically speaking.
Oh,
but then
yeah,
you realize she was covering the logo on
Ferrari
the car,
logo. Yeah, I love that. That was really funny.
To see it.
Yeah,
like that's really great, and it's something that he purposefully manufactured by telling Alfonso he wanted Linda to walk in over by the cars, so the cameras would be attracted or to her when she's by the car, so the logos would be there in the photo. Wonderfully schemed there. Or there's the whole thing of him starting his own rumor that he's talking with the Ford family, something he leans into as a financial and branding opportunity. So it's interesting how, as much as he's motivated by cars, we see very little of that side with Enzo. A little bit early on, especially with the church and the racing that takes place there on the track afterwards. And of course the big race at the end, but everything in between is, if it's not the family drama, it's him being a marketing man. That's what he's forced to do now.
And I think that's what's fascinating, because the film does a good job at least assuming and interpreting Enzo Ferrari as someone that, despite his problems, he's not an idiot, right? Like he knows what he's doing as a marketer. He's pretty clever in the way that he's able to do things, which makes the fact that the company Ferrari is under hot water and they need to sell more vehicles kind of ironic. That despite his intelligence, he's running a failing business at this point, and that's because he's focused on the wrong things.
Well, not because he's not smart. He clearly is. He's just more committed to the racing than the business.
Yeah, and as we said, that's basically his vice. That's him trying to fill a void and trying to prove a point that he thinks he needs to keep proving to really save face for himself and what he's going through. And I think the psychological aspect of it is it's very much there.
Absolutely. And while I think you can argue that there's a sense of control he has there, on the racing side of it, he can't control what's happening there on the track.
Right.
In terms of the collateral damage, if you will, the death rate, as we noted earlier, there's so many factors that are outside of that's outside of his control, that adds to the accumulating effect of financially this is getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Maybe he could have pulled the reins on that earlier, but he's so committed. And so it's
Yeah.
interesting to see him kind of work within those confines of volatility there. Shall we talk about the ending?
Yeah. I have some thoughts on that.
All right. Do we want to do this in spoilers?
I guess because this is history after all. So
It is. It is history.
I did go into this movie knowing about this particular crash.
Same.
Like
Yeah.
I knew about it, and it doesn't affect the I guess the way it's depicted or how you might feel about it. I think it's fine if you know it. So I guess we could be a bit detailed with it.
Okay. We'll get into some details here. Maybe we don't have to reveal some of the ending, like the final scene of this film, some of those details.
Sure.
But when it comes to the crash, it is history. It's Michael Mann. He shot so much of this film on location.
Yeah.
And this crash, it is the real location where the crash took place.
Yeah.
So there is an authenticity to it. He doesn't hold back. He shows the entire thing in all of its gory detail.
And this is the crash that involves driver Deportago, his name is. And it involved not just his death as the driver, but I believe 9 spectators, including 5 children.
And his navigator as well.
And his navigator, yes.
Yeah. So it was
and
really
this is really the fact that it's here is really interesting. And this is where I keep making the comparisons to something like Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, but for the opposite reasons, because that's a film that chooses to depict violence in an audible way without showing us that. And it makes for a very interesting experiment about what it means to showcase violence and carnage and horror on screen and how you can go about that. Michael Mann does it very differently. He very deliberately shows us the impact and the aftermath of it. And it's very graphic. It is a very, very graphic scene. And I'll just say this. I like that he chose to include it for simply bringing about that conversation about what it means to showcase this and why it might be important to showcase things like this in a very different way and in this particular way. So I'll just say that I think him including it is a wise choice. I think the sequence itself is very badly rendered. This is my biggest problem with the movie. I think it looks horrible. And I just like, maybe it's because of the situation I watched it in. To me, it looked like an AI simulation. And I don't know if it was supposed to, because we know that Michael Mann is someone that has dabbled in digital versus film stock before for experimental reasons. He did that with Public Enemies. So I don't know if there was a point in trying to depict it in this way. I think the aftermath shot of what we see is very visceral and haunting. That is a very effective sequence.
But you're talking about just the crash itself.
Just the crash itself, I think, lacks a certain weight and a certain like literal sense of gravity to it. And I think it looked fake. It really looked fake to me. And that's, if I have one big problem with the movie, that's it. And I in a way, I kind of wish I saw this on the big screen so I could, see it in maybe the proper setting where some of those visual effects are more easily masked. But it sadly didn't look very good to me.
Okay, so when it comes to this crash sequence, I will agree with you. I love that he goes there because it does add gravitas to that idea we talked about earlier, this polarity that takes place between the beginning of the film and the end of the film, and the carnage, the death that follows Enzo at home and at work. So I think the film has to go there. And being as graphic as it is, it only gives more weight to that idea within Enzo and him having to grapple with his choices and this endeavor that he's in. When it comes to the actual crash itself, I do think Brendan is right. It is something out of a Marvel movie.
It is.
It is
looks incomplete.
Marvel DC effects
Yeah.
that are jarring because everything else in this film is so lived in and authentic that for a brief moment to immerse us into the world of the MCU or Aquaman or whatever. It is a little jarring. It is like the effects are like the way the car moves and the way it tumbles over. It does. It's very CG heavy. For sure.
Yeah.
Now that said, I still the sequence is still very effective for me.
Okay.
Like it's the crash itself is brief. It's a few seconds, and then we get to the aftermath, and you get this long panning shot that again is very graphic.
Yeah.
And that comes back to being into this lived-in quality.
Yeah.
So it's really, I don't know, a 10-second shot at most where the film transplants into something else. So it's brief. It is a big part of the movie.
That's the thing.
And I can understand why that would not just take you out, but maybe be a little deflating because it is such a big part of the movie.
Yeah,
But
and
I
a
think
very
it gets
big thematic part of the movie, as you said. It's meant to
For sure,
represent
for
like
sure.
the lack of control literally happening in that scene is
Yes.
symbolic of Enzo and what he's going through.
For sure.
So maybe that's why it's meant to look bad, because it's almost as if Michael Mann had a vision for it, wasn't able to execute it because the technology wasn't there. It was beyond his control, so it looks the way that it does. So maybe
That
there's a
could be
meta. No, see, like
Yeah,
I am
that's funny. I
trying to
don't know.
find defenses for it because Michael Mann makes very methodical and deliberate choices, right?
Yes.
Like I said,
Yes.
he has dabbled and experimented with digital technology in his films before that do have sometimes wavering results. Like
Yeah.
I mentioned, Public Enemies. That movie is, if I'm not mistaken, shot digitally and has this kind of wavering kind of camera movement to it that just looks awkward at times. And I do think that is kind of the point, to showcase how that film's time period and its sense of place can still have a modern lens to it, right? And maybe he's doing something similar with the rendering of the crash here for some type of thematic point. I just don't know what that is. All I know is what I'm seeing now doesn't look very good. And it's kind of unfortunate that it is taking me out of the movie for a very crucial moment here.
And that's very fair. That's all very fair. It didn't bother me too much because I still think the emotional weight is there. The symbolic fortitude of it all is still intact for me. And he remedies that, to your point, if he is aware that, hey, I don't have full control over this. And to almost an objective degree, he doesn't, because he's not a CGI artist.
No.
Like he has to put that in the hands of others.
Yeah.
Of course, he can direct them through that, but
he has to sign off on whatever they give him then too.
exactly, but I still think he gets the emotional and symbolic part of it, and he remedies that immediately afterwards, whether he's aware of it or not, with this long panning shot that re-immerses us back into the violence and the gravity of it in this really great way. So
let
think
me ask you this. Sorry to cut you off, but do you think it would have been more effective then if we didn't see the crash and only got that aftermath shot?
Maybe, but I appreciate that he's willing to go there, because like by showing the bystanders, and again, it's not just adults. We're talking about children here.
Yeah.
And he's committing to the historical fact of it all.
Yeah.
And he foreshadows it in a great way. Like, I think he handles it with diligence before committing to the full violence of it.
Yeah.
And I think by showing us what happened, even though it's a little messy in the rendering, by fully committing to it, to me, it adds to the extremity of that whole circular polarity.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that he goes there. I kind of want to defend it and say that it has to be there, mess and all.
Yeah. And when I brought up that question to you, if it would have been more effective without it and just included that panning shot, which is very effective in its own right.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do feel the urge to defend Michael Mann for including it, because it gets back into that point I made about what it means to depict such violence and carnage on screen to convey something without it coming off as gratuitous. In some ways, it's almost like an experiment. In an antithetical way to something like The Zone of Interest, which showcases violence in a very audible way by not showing it to us. And because of that, it's more harrowing for it. This is meant to be horroring in a different way.
Yeah, exactly.
If anything, I am defending the experimentation, even if I don't think the rendering is there.
No, I agree. We talked about how the zone of interest thrives in the less is more of it all. This is the more is more
Yeah,
of it all.
exactly. That's a
And
great way to put it.
I love that
Yeah.
because I think it absolutely speaks to not just the experimental angle of it that you're talking about there, but the emotion. I think I
Sure.
do think it's necessary, even though the rendering is a little weird. It is a little odd, but it's brief enough, and we get back to the grounded reality very quickly. That in the end, I thought the scene was extremely effective still.
Yeah,
And then,
that scene was.
soon because you see the carnage, and then soon Enzo arrives there, and you see his reaction to it all, and them trying to find out what happened.
Well, that's the other thing that's so
devastating.
that's so devastating about it too, is that there's a human level here that Enzo almost feels forced to ignore, like the human tragedy of it all, because he has to defend his own business at this point now. Like instantly, they have no time to grieve. They have to analyze this. They have to put a procedure in place and basically do some forensic analysis that proves that their car wasn't faulty.
Yeah.
And the fact that they have to jump right into that procedure, like that's a devastating idea already. And I don't know if Michael Mann is trying to say something about that, but I kind of got the sense that in Adam Driver's performance, it's almost like he's fighting back some type of emotion because he is forced to still work around this tragedy.
Which we see also earlier in the film. This was set up.
Yeah.
I don't think this is out of nowhere, but it was set up earlier in the film in that first
Foreshadowing.
crash.
Yeah.
Where the driver flies out, he's killed, and there's a shot, there's a wide shot, I guess more of a medium shot of Enzo reacting to the crash, and it's that same thing of it's like he's having to internalize that grief and emotion, and his next, like his reaction to that, or his next choice immediately following that crash is, well, I got to get a new driver.
Exactly.
So you're up. And so like it comes back to the business of it all. He can't afford to get emotional when it comes to the racing. And so then I it's not as if that what you're talking about there at the end, it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah,
even if it is still jarring regardless.
And I think that's the other thing about the film that I think is pretty interesting, is that it, without setting up that final crash, it actually does set up that final crash, right? Like, because it is foreshadowed in the beginning like that. You know that even if you don't know the history, you know the shoe is about to drop at some point, right?
At some point, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, it gives it to you. But that's the other thing that Michael Mann is very good at, is that he just knows how to create tension, whether it be literal physical tension in a movie like Heat or Thief, for instance, or in this case, there's something kind of cryptic about it. Like he knows that he is building to something, and he's trying to get the audience aware of that. So when it does happen, it still surprises you.
I agree. I find all of that effective, and I kind of wonder if this film will age extremely well in that regard when you invoke films like Heat and Thief. Because I look at those movies, even Black Hat to a degree, where this has a level of action to it, but what resonates with Thief and Heat isn't the action in those films. I mean, maybe to a broader commercial degree, but what defines those films is the character work.
It is, yeah.
That's what's fascinating about those films. Like, that's why they're 5-star masterpieces.
They are,
not to say that this is a 5-star masterpiece, but this is very much in that same camp where, sure, it has some action to it, but like Thief and some of his others, like, it's not about the action.
No, it's
about
not.
The character work, and the character work here, I think, is still really great.
Absolutely, but movies like Thief and Heat, and even The Insider as well, while they do thrive more on those character dynamics and those thrills as secondary, much like all of Mann's films. I will say those three films are certainly more immediate than some of Mann's later films, right? Like movies like Ferrari, and then Black Cat, Public Enemies, to an extent Miami Vice, which is a film I like a lot more than you. Those are films that I had to learn to like more as time went on, right? Like I found more things with them. And that's not to say that movies like Thief and Heat are lesser. In fact, I think they're probably his 2 or 3 best movies. The Insider, Heat, and Thief, I think, are his 3 best. But they are more immediate, right? Like you find love for them pretty much right from the get-go. And then you find that they even grow more with time. Whereas there's kind of this like weird cryptic nature to later period Michael Mann. Like he's very sneakily creating great movies, but you don't realize they're great until years later. It's kind of interesting. And I think Ferrari is going to be one of those films. I think this one will get better, but we'll get better with time.
I kind of wonder if Manhunter is in that same realm, though.
Well, I think the thing with Manhunter is that it was sort of, I mean, it came out so early in his career. I think it started to gain traction because of the success of The Silence of the Lambs, and then people probably didn't see it as the better version. And then as time went on, people, actually, this movie is quite good.
And that's what I mean. Like it's more of the aftermath than the immediacy of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think Manhunter is also a 5-star masterpiece. That's one of his very best movies.
Top 5, definitely top 5 for me.
Man, it's probably top 2 for me.
Yeah.
Top 2.
Well, I think the difference, the big difference that you and I have with Michael Mann is that I like Miami Vice a lot more than you. That's also top 5 for me. But as far as the top 3, like I said, Insider I think is his masterpiece, and then Thief and Heat round out my top 3 there. But man, Miami Vice, Manhunter, I love those films. I really enjoy Collateral. Public Enemies I liked a lot more as time went on. I don't always love that film, but I like a lot of what it's doing.
That's still
Black
my
Cat,
least
I think.
favorite, but
Public Enemies is?
yeah.
Okay. I haven't seen The Keep, which I know most people cite as his worst movie.
Okay. Besides, I haven't seen The Keep. That's actually a spot. But
Yeah.
but all the rest of them I've seen.
Yeah, same.
And that's
even my least favorite of all of his films is a film I still quite like, and that's The Last of the Mohicans. I still think there are some good things in that movie as well.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
He's such an interesting filmmaker. And I hope he makes movies more often than, 8 years between this. But then again, Ferrari was a very unique take because this is something he's been working on for almost 40 years, as we talked about. Yeah.
A long, long time, yeah. So, I think Ferrari in time could have a Manhunter kind of like a reevaluation.
For sure.
Or maybe like Miami Vice, to your point, or Black Cat.
Yeah.
You know, because I think it's very good. I think once people get beyond the disappointment of, this isn't a racing movie. And
that's the thing,
I kind of wonder, though, also how broad that is. And the reason I say that, I watched Ferrari with a couple of friends of mine who are huge F1 fans.
Okay, interesting.
But they're not cinephiles by any stretch of the imagination. These two very much fall into what you would describe as the general public. They get to the theater a couple of times a year, kind of thing.
Gotcha.
But they watched Ferrari with me, and they loved it. They thought it was great. And I didn't necessarily warn them because I didn't know what I was walking into, really. So I couldn't sit there and say, hey, this is not going to be a racing movie. And maybe in hindsight, I could have, because it's Michael Mann and I should know better. But I did not tell them that. We experienced it together for the first time, and they also loved it. So maybe there's something that, maybe some critics feel that way and they're driving some of the conversation. Maybe it won't be as broadly accepted as, this is a disappointing movie.
You know what I think is interesting about that? Because I mentioned that movies like Miami Vice, Public Enemies, Black Cat, and now potentially Ferrari are the ones that have seen probably the biggest reevaluations with Michael Mann's career, or at least those in his filmography. I think the coincidence, or at least the common theme between all 4 of these movies, they were kind of mismarketed. They were marketing films that weren't these. Like like Miami Vice, not really a Florida-based crime thriller, right? What else? Public Enemies, not really a thriller. Black Hat, not really a cyber thriller. All of these movies are way more introspective, and the marketing doesn't really suggest that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. A lot of these movies found audiences when people began to realize what their respective intents were.
Yeah.
And when you are able to accept that, you can accept the movie for what it is. And maybe that's what's happening here too with Ferrari.
And it's such a double-edged sword, right? Because you
Yeah.
might get a few more, butts in the seats by marketing Ferrari the way they have.
Yeah.
But you're also going to render more disappointment by doing it that way.
Yeah. If anything, I'd say the Michael Mann film as of late that was probably the most correctly marketed was Collateral. But that's also one of his more straightforward thrillers and an effective thriller as well. But that's kind of the outlier in that regard.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, I wonder how the general audience will respond. It might not be as divisive as some of the reviews have suggested, but I could still see people being disappointed with it because it's not a racing movie. If that's what you're expecting out of this, then sure, you're going to be disappointed. But this is Michael Mann through and through.
It is. Yeah.
So, I mean,
it's a good movie. Good movie.
I love that. You just have to take the manisms of it all. And I think
you got to understand where the manhole goes.
Exactly. All right. I guess that'll do it. Unless you have any other final thoughts you want to speak to with Ferrari.
I'll just simply say, much like I'll echo my own conversation on the Zone of Interest, but I think I'm going to like this film more as time goes on. I think I need to see it again, though. There's a lot to mine from this in true Michael Mann fashion. And I like I said, I think I will like this more with time. But thinking about it from a technical standpoint, it's a very well-made film. Daniel Temberton's music is also very good too.
Yeah. Sure.
So I want to at least give credit to the musicality here. I think that's also very good. And the music is chosen to be employed at the right moments. We mentioned that one scene at the cemetery with Adam Driver grieving for his son. That's a long take. It lingers on a close-up of him, and it easily could have utilized score to emphasize the emotion, and it doesn't. It's a very quiet scene, and I appreciated that. So it's a very patient film. It's one that I think people need to discover in time what it's actually doing. And I don't think people have discovered that quite yet.
No, good stuff. I agree. As far as some other final thoughts, do want to echo you on the score. I did find it effective for sure. Also want to shout out Patrick Dempsey once again. I think he's really fun here in a small
No idea
role.
He was in this movie. That was amazing.
But it's also interesting because he drives race cars in real life as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of a meta thing
coming together.
Yeah,
and I believe he's actually driven in the Le Mans race. So that adds some interesting irony to all this. Not that this is about Le Mans, but kind of in that realm. And also, we didn't talk about this on the main show or when we reviewed The Killer as well. But I found Michael Fassbender's conversation with Carey Mulligan so fascinating because he also talked about this. We wondered where the hell he went since 2017. It turns out he's been racing cars. That's what he's been doing. He's been joining Patrick Dempsey on the track because I think he noted he drove in Le Mans twice.
That's amazing.
Over the last
it's so neat
8 years or whatever it's been.
Wow.
So
actors need a hobby, I guess.
They need another hobby besides acting, I guess. So yeah, I mean,
I think for some of them, it's just a job.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, but yeah, he's really fun here. I mean, all of the supporting cast is pretty good here. Yeah, really like this movie a lot. Love its subversions, and I recommend it. So there it is.
Yeah, with a bit of with an asterisk, I guess, because people might not know what they're getting into. If they've only seen the trailers, you're probably not going to get that movie that's been advertised.
That's true. That is true. I think the film rules, though. I
like
really
it. I like it
a lot.
as well. Yeah.
So, all right. With that said, that'll do it. Leave a comment on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Let us know if you agree or disagree with us. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. You can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please rate and review us on those platforms. Really helps out the show a lot. And I guess that'll do it. Do you have any final thoughts on anything right before we get out of here?
Just Penelope Cruz once again. Good stuff.
Oh my gosh. Maybe we should have mentioned her again. I mean, we talked about her in Driver's performance specifically. I think they're both Oscar worthy here.
I think
Cruz
yeah, I think
is
they're both really
especially
good.
electric. Like I love Driver's performance for the reasons we talked about, but yeah, there's an electricity to Cruz here that is palpable.
Yeah,
It's so good.
it's really great.
Yeah. So I wish she would be in the conversation more. Best Actress has some pretty great candidates.
Yeah.
So it
It's pretty competitive. Yeah,
It's
there's a
very
pretty stiff
competitive.
competition there.
But I think what I'm disappointed by is just the lack of conversation around her performance.
Yeah.
She's not even in the conversation all that much. Hopefully with the Academy she is. Maybe she'll come out of nowhere. Who knows?
Maybe.
That happens from time to time, but
Maybe.
we'll see.
We shall see.
All right. At any rate, I do hope that she is considered because she is really quite great here. So, yeah, love these performances. And Shailene Woodley, objectively hilarious. We'll reiterate that one.
Oh, I love her, though. I love her. I think she's a very talented actress. Just
Absolutely.
very funny work. Very funny work.
Absolutely. All right. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, gotta love
The manhole. The manhole.
Manhole. Going down it once again.
It's always a fun trip.